Just trying to figure out.
Live.
Yeah. Welcome back to Senate Education. Today is January 11th, 2:40 in the afternoon. We have with us, or we are about to have with us, I believe, Dr. Boucher and Ms. Gorham. And we'll wait for them to arrive. Dr. Boucher, Ms. Gorham, how are you both?
Hello, Mr. Chair. I'm great. It's nice to see you.
Good to see the two of you. We really appreciate you being with us. You are kicking off our conversations, trying to understand and help new committee members and returning committee members and others watching really what a Vermont education looks like. We are going to hear from teachers, students, other school personnel. And we thought we would kick it off by just getting an overview. And I see that you have this Vermont assessment results document for us. Thanks for sending it along. And thank you, Hayden, for printing it. To kind of give us a snapshot of testing and test scores, how they work, what we should be looking for. Vermont historically generally is celebrated as a state that does a good job, but we also know there are areas where we can improve. And one most recently is the work that this committee did on literacy. So with that, I am going to hand it over to the two of you, and I would ask a couple of things just to make sure that are included in your presentation. One, just tests in general. A little bit of, hey, this is good, reliable information. This is what parts that you might want to take with a grain of salt. This is what we're trying to evaluate. This is what you're really seeing. That would be very helpful. And then I would also keep in mind, as you're going through other groups, organizations, people that we should talk to that can help give us this sort of baseline of what Vermont education is. So with that, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So for the record, my name is Heather Boucher, and I am the Deputy Secretary for Education. I wanted to start by expressing my disappointment that I couldn't meet you all yesterday in person. I'd really been hoping to do that. I'm not sure how many of you have furry children, but I have a very doted upon furry child who actually potentially has a stomach obstruction because of something that he's eaten. And so I was tasked with watching him all day yesterday. He seems to be doing well. He's a dog. So anyway, that's why I couldn't see you in person, and I do apologize. I am here joined with Amanda Gorham, Dr. Amanda Gorham, who is our brand new, although she's been in the agency for several years now. She is our brand new division director-ish, a couple months now, right, Amanda? Of our division of data management and research. And you may have heard about that division when Secretary French testified yesterday, I believe. So Mr. Chair, she is the new Wendy Geller, just to keep things in perspective of sort of the movement within positions in our agency. So we are, I think, that's a great question that the committee is posing and getting answers on. We're very happy to help assist committee members in understanding the answers. I would say plural to the question of what does our education system look like, how are students doing, and all related questions thereupon. We are, as Mr. Chair said, going to focus today on just some broad sweeps of how our students are doing in terms of our latest, at this point, their preliminary state assessment data. And Dr. Gorham will get into some of those details about the different kinds of testing that we do that might actually address the point that you had brought up, Mr. Chair. So I'm going to pipe down and let Amanda take it away, and then I will also be perhaps piping back in throughout provide some additional context, or if there's a point that I think would be really helpful for the committee to know. And then, of course, we'll throughout and at the end be very interested in questions.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Boucher. And Dr. Gorham, I should mention that our committee assistant also put in our folders this preliminary 2022 statewide assessment results, just so you know that we have that as well in front of us. So with that, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I am going to share a PowerPoint presentation on the screen. So I'm just going to take a moment to acclimate myself here. Oh, I cannot share my screen. Maybe I can now.
I believe you can. Yeah.
I can now. Okay, we're in good shape. All right. All right. So I'm going to take you through some results from the 2022 school year. We'll discuss some of the interpretations of those results, including limitations and comparability. And then we'll wrap up with what we believe we can learn from a year of testing. So first, I will note that this presentation is going to cover the state assessments that were administered during 2022. So we have the Smarter Balance Assessment Consortium provided assessments of ELA and math. We have the Vermont Science Assessment, which is sometimes referred to as the VTSA. And we also have the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the NAEP assessment in reading and math, which was administered across the state as well. I do want to note here that this is not like a comprehensive overview of the assessment program that the state administers. We do also have the assessment of English language proficiency, which is administered to our English learners. There's an alternate assessment. And of course, our districts and schools administer various local assessments in addition to these assessments to better understand student achievement at different points throughout the school year and for different purposes. So this is sort of just a limited scope of what you might see happen throughout a year.
Amanda?
Yes.
Just wanted to clarify, as new committee members are probably already learning, we are very deep in acronym land in education. And so ELA is English Language Arts. So it is what most folks in the world think of as English, just so you know. It's a broad spectrum of reading, writing, comprehension, all those kinds of things. But when you see ELA, that's what it means is kind of English for the rest of us. Would you agree, Amanda?
Yeah. Yep. Thank you, Heather.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So moving along here, just a quick note on using assessment results. We want to acknowledge that assessments are one of many tools that we can use to learn certain things and limited things. There isn't one assessment that tells us everything about everything. We take great care in ensuring that results from these assessments are used appropriately, and we also encourage appropriate use of these assessment results. And lastly here, I'll note that the results from state and national assessments, like the ones presented here, are intended to inform decisions at the state, district, and school level, and they capture learning that has already taken place. So they're not assessments that are given during the course of learning and can immediately be used to inform instruction. These are more final or summative measures here that we're reporting on. Quickly, so that you know the nature of results that are being presented here today, for our state assessments of ELA, math, and science, we're reporting preliminary results. That's what you would see in the press release that came out yesterday. So these results are not official. They are not final.
What makes them, Dr. Gorham, what makes them official?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So we would consider the results official when they have been matched up with our enrollment records. So right now they have not been matched with our data collections for enrollment. And so we're considering these preliminary. The scores that each student has has earned do not change, but where those students are reported to could theoretically change depending on where they were enrolled during different times of the test window. So we hold these as preliminary, and then once the assessment results have been matched with our enrollment records, they'll be published in the annual snapshot, which we anticipate to be published later this winter. And that's when more detailed results, such as school and district level results, will become publicly available.
Thank you.
Of course, of course. The National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the NAEP, those results have already been released publicly. They are official. They are publicly available on NCES's website. And so we will be presenting on official results for that assessment. And here we dive in. So what we're showing here is for our English language arts assessment provided through Smarter Balance last year. We are showing the percent of students who were proficient or above at each grade level. So you'll see here numbers hovering somewhere between 40 and 50. And something that I want to point out here is that when we say proficient, right, we are not talking about a measure that has been defined by a test vendor or anyone outside of Vermont. What we're looking at is a standard that has been set by Vermont educators. And that standard qualifies what a student must know and be able to do to be considered proficient. That's decided by our Vermont educators through something called a standard setting study. And so what we're seeing here, kind of to put it into context, is that 41% of our grade 3 students achieved in a way that our Vermont educators would consider to be proficient minimally on that assessment.
What then can the remaining third graders not do?
Well, we assess a variety of standards. And so the answer to that question would vary depending on the student. The student could be, I think that if we describe the assessments in more detail, it might be a little easier to understand. So our English language proficiency assessment has different targets that we are assessing, right? We have listening, we have reading, we have writing for examples. And within that, there's different standards that students are being assessed on. And so we can't really say that if a student is not proficient, they're not proficient at listening, or they haven't met this specific content standard. It's going to vary across students. And so that's when we kind of have to take that deeper dive into the assessment data and also look at other measures to understand what that percentage of students could be working on to gain proficiency.
Okay. Yes, please, Senator Hashim.
Dr. Gorman, I was wondering if you could just share how these results compare to the rest of the country. Or is that later on? I was looking through this, I haven't seen it yet. If it's later on in the slides.
Yeah, so we can actually use the NAEP to look at results across the nation. Our Smarter Balanced assessments of ELA math and our science assessment are state specific. So what we can't really compare to other states with those assessments because they're based on our state standards and our teachers and educators' expectations of proficiency. But the NAEP really is like the national standard. And so later in this presentation, we will look at Vermont compared to the nation. And so we'll get to that in just a few more slides. But for this assessment, this assessment provided by Smarter Balance and the Vermont Science Assessment are really intended to show us a state-specific perspective.
Thank you.
So the next graph that I will show you is our math assessment results, the preliminary results from 2022. And what you can visually see here is sort of a decline in percent proficient as we advance in the grade levels. Grade 3 being the highest percent of students being proficient, and then kind of dropping down from there all the way to 26% in grade 9. This is something that I think that the nature of these results can be seen in other years. We don't recommend comparing these results to other years, but I think the nature of the performance that we see for math is something that we have seen before in Vermont.
So I think what would be, just so I don't forget it, is to have you back in next week to pull this apart a little bit. I appreciate what we're doing today, but I would like to get a sense of the things that perhaps our eighth graders, that's over 70% of eighth graders aren't getting something. And so either come back in with sample tests, some examples, because we are, like you, looking to make improvements on all this. So as much information we can get our heads around, the better.
Sure,
Great.
thank you, Mr. Chair. All right, and just presenting this performance levels for science here for percent proficient. We administer our science assessment in only 3 grade levels, grades 5, 8, and 11. And the assessment is designed to assess sort of a broad range of standards so that we're not just capturing grade 8 science, but we're kind of capturing standards that a student experiences across the grades in between. And so, it can be a little bit challenging to interpret these results, I think, because we're not looking at 1 year after the next. But we can see that, we have between about 30 and 40% of students across grade levels reaching at least proficiency on the science assessment. So I've taken these results by subject and clustered them here together. And I've done this because I think it really highlights the difference between ELA and math as the grade levels advance. So you can see that gap between ELA and math proficiency widening as you advance in the grade levels. It also highlights the difference for grades 5 and 8 between ELA and science.
So just to clarify, because it can be hard to digest these more complicated slides. So the first piece about a stronger gap between English and math is if you come across over time, over grade, is if you compare the distance between the green and blue bars. So you can see that that's actually, it's really not statistically significant in grade 3. And then by grade 9, you're comparing 45% proficient to 26% proficient, just to clarify.
Thank you, Heather.
Yes, please.
Just out of curiosity, how come there are, for example, between grade 6 and then 7, then also grade 9, there's no proficiency for science?
That's a great question. Thank you. So science is only, the science assessment is only administered in grades 5, grade 8, and grade 11. So you won't see a measure for science in grades 3, 4, 6, 7, or 9.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that, just to follow up, is that the science assessment is a bit more complex. So it actually has performance tasks. Students are actually doing things as opposed to just answering questions. And obviously in math, they're making calculations and things like that. But part of the reason is that those assessments are different. What they're assessing are a combination of performance and typical types of assessment questions. The other thing in our state plan, we're trying to balance the work that it takes to actually do the assessment in the classrooms, like in the schools, with instructing students. And so that also factors in because it does take time away from classroom, from instruction when we are doing assessments.
Thank you, Heather. Okay, so I'm going to transition into the NAEP results. So again, this is an assessment that is administered nationally. And so this assessment does allow us to look at Vermont versus the nation. And And so we're presenting here reading first, and it's a similar measure, percent proficient or higher. And there are 2 bars for each grade level here. So the light green bar is for Vermont, and that is the percent of students who scored proficient or above in 2022 for Vermont. And we're comparing that to the darker green bar, which is the national public for 2022. So that's students in other public schools in the nation. I thought, as we're going through this slide, someone might ask, well, where was Vermont in 2019 then? And so I have added this little diamond here to indicate where performance was for Vermont in 2019. In case that's something that someone is curious about, we can kind of cover it on the same slide. So things I'd like to mention about this graph. Only the grade 8 difference between Vermont and the nation is statistically significant. So that means that even though 34% of Vermonters scored proficient or above, and 32% of the national public scored proficient or above, so there is a 2% difference there, but that difference is not statistically significant. It could just be due to chance. With grade 8, this difference between 34% and 29% is statistically significant. It is not likely just due to chance. And so we can say that Vermont in 2022 outperformed the nation in grade 8 reading, in grade 8 reading.
Well, I'm not sure if I would agree with that. Well, let me tell you my concern. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think Vermont has as many English as a second language students as, let's say, some other states. We don't see those numbers in this state yet. I could be wrong, but it doesn't seem exactly apples to apples to me. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I would slightly disagree, Mr. Chair. Because this is the national sample, they deploy a very sophisticated statistical sampling method. So they actually would they are including a proportional number of ELA students to actually be able to make, for each state to actually be able to make these comparisons. So for instance, typically what they would do would be to weight the results with certain coefficients. I'm getting very technical here. So that they actually are apples to apples and not apples to oranges. But it's a great thought and a great question.
No, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Tell me if you would agree or
think
disagree with this. I mean, those numbers, 70% of kids in the United States of America in 8th grade are not proficient in reading. I mean, to me, that is startling, and I think most Americans would agree. We need to do something about that.
We would agree, and we actually really are thrilled to get the opportunity to talk about these assessment results, very frankly, with the committee, because we do think it is time for us to be thinking about not only nationally, but how can we improve in terms of our state. It would be great, just one last piece, it'd be great like if we had 60% in Vermont proficient compared to the national average. So yes, we're higher, but we're not amazingly higher.
Right.
Thank you, Chair. To your point, I think what you may have been getting at a little bit is sort of demographic, what we look like demographically in Vermont versus the country. And I was wondering if we might be able to get a comparison to our New England neighbors at some point. That just might be interesting to see Vermont versus Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, et cetera.
It's a great idea. Can we get that?
Yeah, absolutely. We'd be happy to come back and present more on NAEP and the comparisons to other states and across the nation, or just to provide materials that are more descriptive.
Do our Canadian neighbors offer a similar test or the same test?
I'm less familiar. Sorry, Amanda. Okay. I'm less familiar with what theirs would be. I would assume they do something, but we wouldn't be able to compare either.
That's fine. Truly. That's fine. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to advance here to look at math. And again, this is the official 2022 NAEP results for math. Similar layout with the graph here. So if we focus on just the bars, we are looking at Vermont in 2022 with the light blue and the national public average for the dark blue bar here. And we are seeing some very slight differences here between the two bars, but neither of these differences are statistically significant. So what we can interpret is that for mathematics in grade 4 and grade 8, we were performing similar to the nation in 2022. You can see here from these diamond shapes that indicate 2019 performance that there has been a dip since 2019 for Vermont. So that's something that we can note there. And I'll talk a little bit more about comparing to previous years in a few slides. But if that brings up that curiosity for you, performance was a bit different in 2019. Okay, and so here we are clustering some results together once again. And again, I think that, you know, showing reading is green, math is blue, as I've tried to keep consistent through the presentation. And this is, on this side, we have Vermont, and on this side, NP stands for National Public. So that's the national population of public school students that participated in the assessment. I think this shows the difference between reading and math achievement within the grade levels. So, you know, for grade 4, it looks pretty similar, but for grade 8, we start to see a gap there. Same thing for the nation, but just a bit smaller. So same information, but just a little bit of a different way to present it. Okay, so we're going to take a break from graphs for a couple slides. Heather, did you need to say something?
Yes, I apologize. I had been muted because I had barking in my background. I also, if you go back to that slide, and you'll recall that we also had with the state level data for 2022, the same, if we look at the breakdown by grade, that we started to see that that same pattern in terms of perhaps doing a little better or a lot better in the early grades for math, and then by the middle to high school years, really declining in terms of our own proficiency scores. So we have a similar pattern with national, with our comparison to national and with our own SBAC scores is the point I'm trying to make here.
Thank you, Heather. Okay, now a break from graphs. So I want to acknowledge some limitations here. First, I will note that the NAEP assessment is administered pretty differently than our state summative assessments, Smarter Balance and the Vermont Science Assessment. With NAEP, there are hired assessment coordinators that come into the schools with machines that are provided to the schools to administer these assessments. So there is some control over how standardized and typical the administration can be. And that is, you know, that kind of led NAEP to be able to make these cross-year comparisons with the 2022 results. For our Smarter Balance and Vermont Science assessments that were administered here within the state, first, I want to acknowledge that the results have not been matched to enrollment. We talked about that earlier. So these are preliminary. But we also have this point about participation in the assessments. 2022 was still, for us, we still consider that a pandemic year for our assessments. We know that in 2021, the year prior, participation, especially for historically marginalized groups of students, participation was quite a bit lower than it typically is. And we believe that we may see a similar trend in 2022, but we don't have official data on that yet. So the results that we are looking at right now, we are not sure how those results should be interpreted given participation of students. So whenever we're looking at these aggregate results, we want to remind ourselves that it might not be all students that are contributing to these average scores or these proficiency levels that we're interpreting. There could be a lower percentage of, say, students with disabilities participating in the assessment during the year. And so we want to acknowledge that. And we also want to acknowledge that the pandemic conditions likely impacted administration of the assessments. We went into detail about that in the press release that you all have with you. But we do know that, with educators being responsible for administering these assessments, and there being educator staffing shortages and also resources being pulled in different directions, things were certainly not typical in 2022 as we saw in 2021. And I see a hand raised.
Thank you, Amanda. Just curious, do you have any kind of thumbnail sketch on what the participation percentage was? You alluded that it was smaller, but doesn't really say anything. Was it 20% smaller, 50% smaller than 2019?
Yeah, I don't have the 2021 numbers on hand for participation, and I apologize for not having that with me. And for 2022, we can't compute that until we have finalized enrollment numbers. So that's something that we would be happy to to provide when we have it available. I can pull up the 2021 numbers though and share those. I'll make a note of it. Sure.
I will note, just as a follow-up to that question, that we are required through federal legislation to have an overall 95% participation rate in our state assessments. Prior to COVID, we would typically, I think, be fine with that. There have always been sometimes from year to year certain districts or schools that struggle for whatever reason to make those that 95% benchmark, but we tended to do quite well overall as a state in that. And so I think that's the other piece of this, is really trying to match to our student enrollment so we can have a much better sense of, like, are there areas where we can really provide some supports around ensuring that students are participating in the assessments. As you can see, it's really critical information for us to have as a state, and we would argue it's critical for parents to know this with their own students as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Heather. Okay, so the next couple of slides, I'll be talking about comparability of results across years. I'm going to start with our state assessments of ELA, math, and science. And I'm going to note that, as an agency, we're not recommending comparing 2021 results to any other year, including 2022. We had great difficulty in administering assessments during 2021, during that school year. And as I already had suggested, we saw lower and uneven participation rates across all students and across subgroups of students. And that makes interpreting the aggregate level results really challenging. As I had said, if we're looking at a proficiency or a percent proficiency or above for all students, we might be interpreting that as all students, when in fact it may mean all students except for a good number of English learners or a good number of students with disabilities. And those are the students that these assessments are meant to serve. And so we really want to be careful in our interpretations, given those participation rates. I also wanted to note here that the 2022 administration was influenced by pandemic-related challenges. And because of that influence and that impact on a standard assessment administration, we don't feel that the administration of the assessment was typical. And so we do not feel that we should be comparing the results to previous years, especially prior to the pandemic. So, for example, in 2019, we had a very standardized administration of the assessment that was very typical. And in 2022, we had an administration of an assessment where a lot of schools were trying to make it work with staffing issues and with resources that were stretched a little thin, and with lower participation rates from some students still lingering from the 2021 school year. And we also had, lingering effects of an interrupted school year from 2021 impacting students as well. We don't want to ignore the social emotional piece as well with students. the emotional state of students prior to the pandemic was very different than it was in 2021 and 2022. We are a little bit challenged in interpreting the results from 2022 at the aggregate level, but we do want to reinforce that making comparisons across years with this particular data is really discouraged. NAEP, on the other hand, has published comparisons between 2022 and 2019 publicly. And I talked a little bit before about how the administration of the NAEP is different in nature than the administration of our state assessments. And so they have come to the conclusion that it is okay for that assessment to make those comparisons. Nationally, the scores have declined since 2019, as evidenced by NAEP. Scores in Vermont also declined since 2019. However, we can't really attribute that solely to the pandemic or the conditions of the pandemic, because what we know is that scores on NAEP have been generally declining for over a decade. I can visually show you that here. And so these, overall, these lines are showing you how participation has changed over the years for about the past decade. I will just note that NAEP is administered every other year, not every year. So that's why you're seeing only a few years here. And I'm going to zoom in a bit here. Okay, so I've kind of gotten rid of the title on the slide so you can see this a little bit easier perhaps. But what we can see is kind of this general trend that's coming down to a decline here. And if you stop at 2019 and don't focus on just the difference between 2019 and 2022, which is very apparent, you can see that the scores were kind of trending down over time. So because that trend existed before the pandemic, we can't say that a decline in scores between 2019 and 2022 is solely due to the conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Although we might be able to say that it exacerbated it. And I think that's what's important, because those lines do have what we would say is a deeper slope on average.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a challenging place for us to be because we don't have a treatment and control group. But yes, Heather, it definitely is a steeper slope at that point, and more information would be able to certainly tell us more. And so we can bring it back up to the top where we've suggested that, more measures is better.
Yeah, and I think what we're trying to communicate, just to clarify a little more, well, Amanda and I jumped into a nerdy research issue, and I apologize because you can tell that that's really both of our bailiwicks. What I think the point that we're trying to make here is that it isn't as though things were wonderful and then the pandemic happened and we suddenly took a nosedive, that there has been this long-standing, I would say, kind of erosion of our performance in the past several years on our national tests. Looking here at 4th and 8th grade. So it's important for us to keep that in mind.
Thank you, Heather. Absolutely. So the final slide that I'll present here is what can we learn? So having looked at all of this information, what can we take away? And firstly, I want to point to participation on these assessments. We really need to be focusing on participation, especially for our students in historically marginalized populations. So that's students with disabilities, English learners, students living in poverty, and there are a few other classifications of students that come into this historically marginalized student group. That we have established and report on. Because participation has been lower for all students and across these subgroups, we are not able to report out on these results and interpret them in the ways that we would like to. Some of the power of these results has been taken away. And so we really need to be focusing on participation so that we can make full use of these assessment results and so that the purpose of the assessment can be fully realized. To summarize some of the results that we've seen, Vermont has seen a decline in the percentage of students achieving proficiency since before the pandemic, which is evidenced by our national assessment results with the NAEP. Again, there is a limitation to that. Assessment scores were declining prior to the pandemic. So we'll just note that as a caveat. And I do want to point out here that our recovery efforts as a state are focused on building an education system that our students and communities need. So really our focus is not on returning to 2019 and student performance in 2019. As Heather has already described, we're really focusing on building out an education system and going above and beyond that to meet the needs of our students and community as we move forward. And that does conclude the presentation for this afternoon.
So thank you both. Dr. Gorham, Hayden will reach out to you about a time next week while it's still fresh with us to come in to talk. As Senator Gulick mentioned, let's compare ourselves to the New England states. Let's also get a sense of what are these questions, what do these tests look like, so we can really understand what students know and do not know. And then I would also say we're going to look to all of you also to help us with some solutions. I mean, we started with literacy 2 years ago, and that bill is now in the works, but there might be more that we need to do. I'm really interested in, are there things that this committee and the legislature can do around math? And then, just other ideas from all of you, so that 10 years we can look back and say, all right, this committee sort of did some work that laid the groundwork. So we're now at closer to hopefully 60, 70, 80% of our students are reading and writing at grade level and are proficient in math. How's that sound?
Mr. Chair, thank you. I appreciate that.
Great.
I would like to note just briefly that we can certainly look at the assessment that was administered in 2022, but I do want to note that we are administering a new assessment starting this year. And so this conversation may be one that, we revisit later on, as well as we look at what the new assessment looks like and what proficiency looks like on that assessment as well.
Senator Weeks, your hand is up, I'm told.
Yes, sir. Just a question. The last bullet on the last slide seems to imply that the needs of our education system aren't necessarily reflected in standardized testing. Is that kind of the, what's written between the lines there? I understand the pre-pandemic comparison, but there's something seems to be more in that sentence that's fully written.
Okay. I think that our state assessments, they do serve the purpose that they're designed for, and that is to inform policy and supports and services for our students. I think that, this sentence really is intended to suggest that we, as a state and how we're interpreting these results, we do not intend to try to determine how to get our performance back to where it was in 2019. Our intention is to figure out how to move forward and surpass that performance.
Right, but does the standardized testing reflect the goals, again, using your words, that the students and the communities need?
I believe it does. I believe that our previous assessment did that, and I believe that the new assessment that we're rolling out really does reflect it. It's informed by Vermont educators, and we've been really thoughtful in the implementation. Okay,
thank you.
Senator Gulick.
I'm just wondering, as we look at these test scores, and they're a little bit concerning, for sure, but everything that happens in education has to be seen in a broader context of society, what's going on in our country, in the world, etc. I am wondering if at some point we can unpack some of those ideas that actually might be within our purview in this committee, and certainly here in the legislature.
Such as
money going to public schools versus private schools. I mean, private schools aren't in this graph. It's not part of these results, but I'd be really curious to know
if their scores are better.
Yeah, and what does that mean? So I mean, obviously I could list a whole bunch of things, but poverty, mental health, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly would be interesting to see if independent school test scores are better, if they're worse where they are, and without a doubt, poverty, nutrition, all those things are huge. I feel like though, as a state, we have to look at these in some way and say, all right, let's say it's not 70% of kids. Let's say it's 50% or even 40%. It seems to me like there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to support teachers who are in the classroom, and to help those kids come to class prepared, for sure. Yeah, please, Senator Booth.
Thank you, Chair. Another elephant in the room might be, for example, if you look at these starting in 2013, cell phone use, social media use, the amount of hours, screen hours that our students are engaging in, especially outside of school. So
Interesting.
I know this is big, but it's very
It's big, but
interesting
it's
and
very
fascinating.
important. Yeah, so along Senator Kulik's questions, if there is research that any of you have that you might be able to bring to the table around these kinds of things, it would certainly help inform our decisions, some of which are certainly in our control, some of which, of course, aren't, but I think they're all legitimate. Yeah. Okay. Anything else at this point?
I just wanted to thank the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are very eager to present these preliminary results, and we're very eager to dig into these and really have some concerted discussions with several stakeholders around our pattern of findings. And we really welcome that work, and we're excited about it.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. And I believe we have Secretary French, who might be in the waiting room.
This is at the end of the hallway.
He's at the end of the hallway. All right, all right. So we'll come in just a couple of minutes. We'll just take a couple of minutes, quick stretch, and Secretary French will join us at 3:30.